Okay, welcome back to AI Paper Podcasts. We're going to unpack something pretty fundamental today. It gets right to the heart of AI and, well, even how we think about our own minds.
Absolutely. It's this huge question. When we see these large language models doing amazing things with language, are they actually understanding concepts like humans do?
Or is it, something else, like just incredibly advanced statistical mimicry, pattern matching on a scale we've never seen before, but without that deeper meaning?
It's the big question, isn't it? They can generate text that looks like understanding, but is the internal process, the way they're structuring information, anything like human thought?
Exactly. And that's precisely what the paper we're diving into today tackles. It's called From Tokens to Thoughts: How LLMs and Humans Trade Compression for Meaning. And it's from researchers at Stanford, NYU, and Meta.
Yeah, it's a really ambitious piece of work. They're using ideas from information theory and combining that with some really classic data from human psychology studies.
Right, trying to quantitatively compare how both LLMs and us, humans, handle this essential trade-off when we form concepts. It's all about balancing making information compact compression versus keeping the important meaning, what they call semantic fidelity.
Okay, so let's do the quick rundown, the 1-minute version for, if you're just grabbing the highlights.
Good idea. So key insight number 1, humans are masters at this. We take loads of complex details and squash them into neat concepts, like robin and blue jay. They both become bird. You lose some details, sure, but you gain simplicity and keep the core, meaning feathers, wings, most fly, that kind of thing.
And LLMs. The paper shows they also group things in ways that broadly line up with how humans categorize. So there's some overlap there. But they seem to struggle with the finer details, the kind of nuances humans find really important.
Like typicality, right? Why a robin just feels more like a bird than, say, a penguin does to us. LLMs don't seem to capture that graded structure very well.
Exactly. And crucially, the paper suggests LLMs show this really strong bias. They seem almost hardwired to go for aggressive statistical compression. Make it tight, make it predictable, pack that information down.
Whereas human concepts, they seem different. They prioritize things like being adaptive, flexible, depending on the context, serving a function.
Yeah.
Our concepts look less statistically neat, less compressed by the paper's measures, maybe.
Maybe because they're built for navigating a messier, more dynamic world. They seem to value that richness, even if it's not the most statistically efficient way to store the info according to the specific mathematical lens.
And that core difference the LLMs drive for statistical tidiness versus human cognition's focus on adaptive richness, that's the fundamental divergence this paper really lights up.
It really gets you thinking about what understanding even means. I mean, human concept formation is just fundamental to how we cope with the world, isn't it?
Totally. Imagine having to treat every single chair or every single bird you see as a completely unique thing. Your brain would just melt.
Right. We group. We see a robin, a sparrow, maybe even a picture of one, and boom, bird. And that label unlocks a whole set of expectations and knowledge. It's an incredibly powerful way to, compress the world semantically.
You're balancing keeping things simple enough to handle, that's the compression or efficiency part, with keeping enough of the essential meaning, the semantic fidelity, so the concept is actually useful for, predicting things, talking about things, interacting with the world.
And that's the puzzle the paper tackles head on. Are LLMs doing that? Are they achieving their impressive linguistic feats by building similar conceptual structures, making similar trade-offs?
Or is it more about learning statistical correlations in text, predicting the next word so well that it looks like understanding, but maybe lacks that underlying conceptual backbone?
It's such a critical question, because if we want AI to do more than just mimic language, if we want it to reason, generalize better, maybe even interact physically in reliable ways, it probably needs internal representations that are more like our concepts.
Concepts that grapple with that same tension, right, between boiling things down and holding on to the important stuff.
Precisely. And to get at this quantitatively, the paper brings together some really interesting tools. It's a cool mix of cognitive psychology, information theory, and of course, modern NLP.
Yeah, I liked how they blended those fields. They pull from classic information theory concepts like Rate-Distortion Theory.
Shannon's idea. Basically, how much you need to compress information, the rate, versus how much detail or fidelity you lose, the distortion. There's always a trade-off.
And they also mentioned the information bottleneck principle.
Right, Tishby and others. That's about finding a compressed version of some input but one that specifically keeps as much information as possible about something else you care about, some relevant variable, while ditching the rest.
So the researchers here adapt these ideas. They create this mathematical objective, this score they call L. And L is designed to capture that balance.
It has two parts, a complexity term, which is sort of like the rate and rate distortion or the compression part of information bottleneck. It measures how compact the representation is.
And the other part is distortion. But their distortion term is specifically about semantic fidelity within the clusters or concepts that are formed.
Exactly. Think of it as measuring the average semantic spread inside a concept. If all the items clustered under bird are very similar in meaning according to their embeddings, the distortion is low. If they're all over the place semantically, the distortion is high.
So L tries to find groupings that are both compact and have low internal semantic spread. It gives them a single number to score how well any set of concepts, human or AI, manages this trade-off.
And to get the human baseline, they did something really smart. They didn't just run a quick online survey. They went back to the foundational studies in cognitive psychology.
Yeah, digging up the classics.
Yeah.
Like Eleanor Roche's work from the 70s on prototype theory.
The idea that categories aren't just checklists, they're organized around typical examples. Her data shows why we think robin is a better example of bird than penguin.
And her later stuff expanding those typicality ratings. Orange for fruit, and so on.
Plus, work like McCloskey and Glucksberg's on fuzzy boundaries.
Yeah.
How sure are people that a rug is furniture? And typicality, again, like dress being typical clothing.
Using these older data sets is a great move, I think. They were collected really carefully based on specific theories. Probably less noisy than some modern crowdsourced stuff sometimes.
Definitely. They pulled all this together into one big data set, over 1,000 items, 34 categories. And importantly, they're making this aggregated data set available, which is great for the community.
Fantastic. Okay, so that's the human benchmark. What about the LLMs?
They tested a whole bunch, different architectures. You got your BERT-style encoders, your GPT-style decoders like Llama, Gemma, Mistral, others like Quinn, Phi, and a big range of sizes from around 300 million parameters up to 72 billion.
A good mix. And they focus on static token embeddings.
Yeah, mostly from the input layer. The idea was to match the kind of context-free judgments humans were making in those classic experiments. Get at the model's inherent conceptual structure before dynamic context kicks in too much.
Okay, framework set, data ready. So they structured their investigation around 3 research questions, RQ1, 2, and 3. Let's start with RQ1. This was about conceptual alignment, right? And sort of how compact the LLM representations are.
Exactly. The basic question was, do the groupings that naturally emerge from LLM embeddings actually match up with human-defined categories? Like, if you just cluster the elements representations of different animals, do you get something that looks like birds, fish, mammals?
How did they test that?
They took the static embeddings for all the items in their dataset from an LLM. Then they used a standard clustering algorithm, k-means, and told it to find k-clusters, where k was the number of categories humans had defined for that dataset.
Okay, so forcing the same number of groups. Then what?
Then they measured how well the clusters the AI made matched the actual human categories. They used a metric called Adjusted Mutual Information, AMI.
Right, AMI tells you how much knowing one clustering tells you about the other, but it corrects for chance agreement. Higher AMI means better alignment.
Precisely. And the headline finding for RQ1, broad alignment. The LLM clusters consistently lined up with human categories, much, much better than you'd expect by random chance. You can see this clearly in their figure 1.
So, okay, that's good news for LLMs in a way. They are picking up on the major ways humans carve up the world, at least at a high level.
They are, but there was a really interesting detail in those results too, wasn't there? Looking at their tables, specifically table 1 and figure 1 again.
Yeah, I saw that. Some of the older encoder-only models, like BERT Large, actually did surprisingly well on this alignment task.
Yeah.
Sometimes even better than much bigger decoder models.
It's quite striking. It really suggests that it's not just about scale, about billions and billions of parameters. The specific way a model is built, its architecture, and maybe what it was trained to do during pre-training seems to matter a lot for forming these human-like abstract categories.
Okay, so they capture the broad strokes of human categories. But knowing birds exist is different from understanding the internal structure of birdness, that typicality thing again, which brings us to RQ2.
Right. RQ2 digs into that internal geometry. It asks, Do LLMs capture the inside structure of human concepts? Like, is the model's representation of bird structured such that robin is somehow more central or closer to the core concepts than penguin is?
Probing the fidelity of the representation within the category. How did they measure that in the model's embedding space?
They compared the human typicality ratings, how typical humans think an item is for a category, with a measure derived from the LLM embeddings. For an item like robin and its category bird, they calculated the cosine similarity.
Cosine similarity. That's the angle between the vectors, right?
Yeah.
So it tells you how closely aligned the embedding for robin is with the embedding for the word bird itself.
Exactly. So the idea is if the LLM captures typicality, items humans rate as more typical, like robin, should have a higher cosine similarity to the category label bird than less typical items like penguin.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
And did they? They correlated these similarities with the human ratings.
Yep, using Spearman's row. That looks at whether the rankings match up. Do the items ranked most typical by humans also tend to have the highest similarity scores in the LLM?
And the result for RQ2.
Pretty clear. Limited capture of semantic nuance. The correlations they found were generally quite weak. If you look at Table 2 and figures 5 and 6 in the paper, many correlations are modest, often not even statistically significant.
Huh. So, knowing an item is highly typical for humans doesn't really predict whether its embedding will be particularly close to the category label's embedding in the LLM space.
That seems to be the case. It suggests the LLM's internal representation of a category might be flatter, more uniform, maybe based more on simple co-occurrence statistics with the label. It doesn't seem to have that rich graded structure around a prototype that cognitive science tells us is so central to human concepts.
Yeah, the paper suggests maybe LLMs just learn a sort of average association, missing the fine-grained prototype-based structure that lets us generalize and reason so effectively within categories.
Which leads perfectly into the third big picture question, RQ3. This is where they bring out the full framework, the L objective, to evaluate the overall efficiency of the trade-off.
Okay, so comparing the strategies, how do LLMs and humans stack up when you consider both compression and meaning preservation together using that L score?
They calculated L for the human categories, as they naturally exist, and for the LLM clusters generated across a range of different numbers of clusters. They also looked at another measure, mean cluster entropy.
Entropy as a measure of compactness. Lower entropy means a tighter, less varied group.
Right. Lower entropy means the items within a cluster are more similar or predictable, more statistically compact. And what they found here was really the crux of the divergence.
What did the entropy show?
Human concepts consistently had higher mean entropy than the LLM clusters. Look at figures 2a and 7. Human categories are, by this measure, less statistically compact, more internally diverse, or messy.
Interesting. So our concepts allow for more internal variation. What about the overall L score, balancing complexity and distortion?
That's where the LLMs seem to win, according to this specific metric. Figures 2b and 8 show that the LLM clusters consistently achieved lower L values than the human conceptual structure across most conditions.
Lower L means more efficient, a better balance of compression and fidelity according to their formula.
According to this information-theoretic formulation, yes. The LLM solutions are closer to the theoretical optimum for minimizing this combined cost of complexity and distortion. They're finding groupings that are, in a purely statistical sense, as defined by L, more efficient than human categories.
Wow. Okay, so let's try to tie this all together. RQ1, LLMs broadly align with human categories, sometimes surprisingly well, even for older models. RQ2, but they don't really capture the internal typicality structure. RQ3. And when you look at the overall trade-off using L, LLMs seem to favor solutions that are more statistically compressed and efficient than human concepts, which are higher entropy, maybe less tidy.
Exactly. It points to this fundamental difference in what these systems are optimizing for.
Which is?
LLMs, trained to predict text based on massive datasets, seem inherently driven towards statistical regularity and compressibility. They excel at finding patterns and encoding them in the most compact way possible to aid prediction.
That's kind of their job description, right? Find the patterns, compress the essence for prediction.
Pretty much. But the paper argues that the relentless drive for statistical efficiency might be precisely what limits their ability to capture the richer, more nuanced, prototype-based structure of human concepts. That structure might be inherently less compressible in a purely statistical sense.
So LLMs make these neat statistical boxes, but they miss the landscape inside the box.
That's a good way to think about it. Human cognition, meanwhile, seems shaped by broader goals. Not just statistical prediction, but things like adapting to new situations, making inferences about causes, dealing with the physical body in a complex world, communicating flexibly.
And those goals might lead to concepts that look less efficient if you only measure statistical compression, but are actually more powerful and versatile in the real world.
That seems to be the implication. It's like our brains invest in a bit more complexity or apparent inefficiency to gain robustness and adaptability. Human concepts are maybe optimized for usefulness in a complex world, not just statistical tidiness and data.
This has pretty big implications, doesn't it, for AI development?
Huge. It suggests that just making models bigger and feeding them more text while optimizing for the same statistical objectives might not be enough to get truly human-like understanding. We might need different objectives, different architectures, maybe guided by metrics like this L function to encourage richer conceptual structures.
And for cognitive science.
LLMs become fascinating tools, almost like computational foils. By seeing where their statistically driven approach differs from human cognition, we can learn more about the unique pressures and constraints that shaped our minds. Why are our concepts the way they are? Comparing them to LLMs can provide clues.
Of course, there are limitations, as the paper notes. It's mostly English, static embeddings aren't the whole story of language, and even classic human data has its limits.
Sure, standard caveats apply. But the core finding about this divergence in strategy, statistical efficiency versus adaptive richness feels pretty robust and important.
Yeah, it really brings us back to that opening question. If LLMs are mastering statistical compression and humans excel at this flexible, rich, maybe statistically inefficient understanding, what does it take to bridge that gap, to really get from tokens to thoughts?
It leaves you wondering, doesn't it? Does true adaptable intelligence actually require embracing a certain kind of complexity, a certain departure from pure statistical optimality to handle the richness and unpredictability of the real world? Maybe a bit of inefficiency is the price of true understanding.
Definitely something to chew on. A fascinating paper.